We're tackling socialism. What is socialism at its core?
At its core, it's about equality. And I don't just mean equality of opportunity, but equality of outcome.
But how do socialists view human nature itself? Can we actually achieve that, given, well, people?
Socialists tend to believe humans are shaped by their environment. We're born blank slates, and society molds us.
Interesting.
So if we create a truly equal society, we can reshape human nature for the better. Big difference in perspective. And it's why socialism has led to so many different movements. You've got those utopian communities, Marxist revolutions, democratic socialism. It's a lot.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. And that's why understanding its history is so crucial. It's like a puzzle. You see how these variations emerge, the successes, the failures, and what it all means for us today.
Okay, so where does this whole socialist thing even begin?
Picture the Industrial Revolution for a moment. Massive inequality, terrible working conditions, poverty everywhere. It's in this setting that we see early socialist thinkers pop up.
Ah, those utopian communities. Trying to create a mini paradise based on sharing and harmony. I've always found that idea fascinating.
Yeah, it's a powerful idea. Think Robert Owen and his New Harmony colony over in Indiana. Owen was convinced humans were inherently good, and if we just removed the, how should we say, distractions of capitalism, he thought we'd finally achieve true cooperation.
I read about New Harmony. Didn't they have this whole credit system based on how much you contributed? Pretty radical for the 1800s, but it didn't last, right?
You're right, it didn't. And this is where it gets really interesting, that clash between these utopian ideals and all good old human nature.
Yeah, utopia meets reality.
Exactly. Owen's colony, like many others, it crumbled. Disputes over work, resources, who was contributing more, the whole thing fell apart.
Sounds like every group project I've ever been a part of, huh?
And it raises this huge question that's haunted socialist movements forever. Can we actually overcome our own selfishness? Or do we need some kind of external structure to make society function?
Are we naturally going to be that harmonious, or do we need some rules and systems in place?
Precisely.
Okay, so utopian socialism, good intentions, but maybe a tad idealistic. Which brings us to Karl Marx. What was his deal?
Marx, he was different, much more systematic, I'd say even skeptical about history and economics. While those utopian socialists were busy building their communities, Marx saw capitalism itself as the problem. He was convinced it was inherently exploitative, and the only way to fix it was to overthrow it.
Through a revolution led by the workers, right? That whole workers of the world unite idea.
Exactly. Marx believed history was this series of class struggles, and capitalism would inevitably lead to its own downfall.
Because the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, until, boom, revolution time.
You got it. And that revolution, he believed, would usher in a socialist utopia, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs and all that.
And everyone lives happily ever after.
Not so fast. Here's where it gets a little tricky. Marx, brilliant as he was, never really gave us a detailed plan for how this utopia would actually work.
Oh.
He was great at critiquing capitalism and calling for revolution, but when it came to the specifics of what came after, kind of vague.
So, like, he just assumed once the workers were in charge, it all sorted itself out.
Pretty much. Which, as history shows us, is rarely how it goes. Revolutions are messy. And that lack of a clear plan, like how would a socialist economy function? How would resources be allocated? Who is making the decisions? That's one of the biggest criticisms of Marxism.
Because it's all well and good to talk about equality and revolution in theory, but how do you translate that to a real working society?
Exactly. And that's where we start to see a divergence between Marx's theory and how socialist ideas actually played out, especially in the 20th century.
You're talking about places like the Soviet Union, China.
Exactly. They took inspiration from Marx, but they also, shall we say, took some liberties.
Okay, so let's get into that.
The Soviet Union's a good place to start. They really went for that whole workers' paradise thing, but there were some detours along the way.
When I think Soviet Union, I'm thinking centralized control, not exactly worker power.
Yeah, you're not wrong. See, Lenin, the guy who led the Russian Revolution, he believed in this idea of a vanguard party.
Vanguard party, that's...
basically a group of, let's say, highly trained revolutionaries who would guide the whole process. He thought the workers weren't quite ready to be in charge themselves just yet.
So much for workers controlling the means of production. It sounds like the party did a whole lot of controlling. And how'd that work out for them?
Let's just say those centralized, top-down approaches, they had some downsides. We're talking forced collectivization of agriculture, shortages everywhere, not to mention the whole gulag system. Not exactly the utopia Marx was dreaming of.
That's putting it lightly. It's like their attempt to engineer this perfect society to get rid of inequality completely, it backfired spectacularly.
Yeah, it's a cautionary tale. Trying to force utopian ideals from the top down to completely reshape human nature through the state, it usually doesn't end well.
It makes you wonder if it's even possible to have that level of equality without some degree of force. Because if you just leave it up to people to be all harmonious and share willingly, wouldn't those with more power, more resources,
Yeah.
wouldn't they just stay on top?
That's the eternal debate, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. But the Soviet Union definitely shows what happens when the state has too much power, even if the intentions are good.
Even if they think they're doing the right thing. Which I guess brings us to another path in the socialist world, social democracy. It's like the more moderate cousin, right? Reform, not revolution.
Exactly. Social democrats, they still care about equality, but they're working within the system, within capitalism and democracy. They see the market as a powerful tool, but they think the government needs to step in, make things fairer, and help those who need it.
So things like universal health care, strong labor unions, free education, policies that try to help working people and reduce inequality, but without, like, blowing up the whole system.
You got it. And social democracy, it really took off in Western Europe after World War II. Countries like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, they built those big welfare states, put a lot into public services, and their inequality levels are relatively low.
Those countries always come up when people talk about how socialist ideas can work in a democracy. Seems like they found a way to balance taking care of people with letting the economy do its thing.
It's a balancing act for sure.
But even social democracy has its critics, right? What are some of the challenges they run into?
One of the biggest criticisms is that it stifles economic growth, that it makes countries less competitive globally. Others say it creates a culture where people depend too much on the government.
So it's all about finding that balance between social justice and, like, letting people have their economic freedom. And speaking of balancing acts, let's switch gears and talk about how socialist ideas have played out in a totally different part of the world, Asia. Can't talk about 20th century socialism without talking about China, right?
Absolutely not. China's story is fascinating. It's this blend of communist ideology and market-driven pragmatism. They went from being a mainly agricultural society to an economic powerhouse in just a few decades.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it. And they did it all under the communist banner, which seems ironic given how much they've embraced capitalism.
Right, a little head-scratching. But the key to China's model is how they've adapted those core socialist principles. The state being super important, a big focus on economic development, they've made it work in a globalized world.
It's like they took the socialist toolkit and built their own version of capitalism.
Exactly. They've welcomed market forces and foreign investment, but the state still has a huge role. It guides the economy, and let's be honest, it cracks down on any dissent.
So it's a system that's led to incredible economic success, but also raises some serious questions about human rights and political freedom.
Absolutely. It's a trade-off, and it's one that a lot of people debate.
It seems like China, in a lot of ways, really embodies that tension we've been talking about this whole time.
You said it. And that tension isn't just in China. You see it in socialist movements and experiments everywhere.
It's a lot to think about. What can we learn from both the successes and the failures of these different attempts at socialism?
One thing that really stands out to me is there's no magic formula, no single way to build a perfectly fair and equal society. Creating a just society, it needs the right ingredients, but you also need to understand how it all works.
Can't just copy and paste from one place to another.
Exactly, and especially not from one historical period to another. We need to be careful with those who think they have all the answers, those who offer these simple solutions to really complex problems.
Totally. And it's funny, when you think about those early utopian communities, they were doing that, weren't they? Experimenting.
They were. They definitely had their issues, but they were also dealing with questions that are still relevant today. They were ahead of their time in a lot of ways. They remind us it's okay to imagine completely different ways of living, of being together.
Those communities, they didn't last, but they left us with some valuable lessons.
Human nature is complicated, power dynamics can get messy, and there's no guarantee that even the most well-thought-out plans will work out perfectly.
Definitely a good reality check for anyone who thinks they have it all figured out.
I think the most important thing is realizing that socialism, it's not just some abstract idea stuck in the past. It's a set of ideas that still impacts our world today.
We've covered a lot of ground, from those utopian communes to the rise and fall of the Soviet Union to China's unique approach